Explain 11 is one of the coolest experiences you can have in virtual reality. This is the most advanced and realistic flight simulator out there, but there is a big problem, and that's the performance. A lot of people have been complaining about the performance in Explain 11 running it in virtual reality, and I've been digging deep into this issue, guys. I've been using the Explain 11 in virtual reality for more than a month now, and finally I think I have the solution to get the best performance by doing some tweaks, by doing some settings and options, by using some software, and almost double the frame rate that gives you the performance that you are expecting in virtual reality. So I really recommend you to watch the whole video, because there are so much things that I'm gonna go through step by step, and I think a lot of the things in the middle of the video are the most important ones. Especially one of the plugins actually does magic for this game in virtual reality. So before we begin, I would like to talk a little bit shortly about the Explain 11 and why the performance is so bad. Guys, this game has gotten native VR support, yes, but this is the first VR preview version. This is not even a beta. Most people call it a beta, but this is actually some kind of alpha version of VR support. And it's still not optimized. The developers are working hard to optimize the game for virtual reality, but they're still not there. The main issue here is that the engine is only using one core to make the rendering or the graphical rendering, and that's a big issue. For now, we cannot use all the cores we have on our CPUs, so no matter if you got 4 cores or 8 cores or even 18 cores, the performance will not get better. So what really is important here is single core performance, and if your CPU is around 4 GHz, the best thing you can do is to actually hire it up with some overclocking. That's gonna be a step part in this little tutorial, but there's so much more that actually gives you much more boost than the overclocking. But I still think that most people need to do some overclocking at least to really squeeze out all the performance you can off your CPU. Also, the performance will vary a lot depending on if you play this on the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift. Guys, Explain 11 unfortunately runs much better on the Oculus Rift, and that is for one simple reason, is that Oculus Rift has a feature or a reprojection method called ASW, asynchronous space warping I think it's called, and that method really can double the frame rate from 45 to 19 frames per second, and that will make the simulator to run with perfect buttersmooth frame rate, while when you use the HTC Vive, you are dependent of the Steam VR built-in reprojections, the asynchronous reprojection, the always-on reprojection, or the interleaved reprojection, which I found does not work that good with the Explain 11. So as a last thing before we begin is that you really need a good CPU and GPU, processor and graphic card, no matter what settings you make. So I would personally recommend you to have at least a GTX 1070 and an Intel i5 or i7 processor of around 4 GHz before you start to overclock it. But anyway guys, that's been too much of talk now. Let's jump into the tutorial and go step by step. Let's go. So let's start off with the overclocking. If your motherboard BIOS has some built-in profiles for overclocking your CPU, you can change to one of those, restart your PC, and your CPU will be overclocked. It can actually give you a lot of more performance in Explain 11 by doing so, but it can also do this the manual way like I'm doing, but have in mind you can destroy your CPU doing so. So if you don't know what to do here, if you're not familiar with overclocking, I would highly recommend you to not touch anything in here, especially the voltages. I do this manually and my CPU is overclocked to 4.9 GHz on all 4 cores. Besides the CPU overclocking, you can also overclock your RAM memory if you know what you're doing. You can choose an XMP profile and get some higher frequency, and in my case I'm actually using 3600 MHz instead of 4000 MHz as my RAM memory sticks are on default, but that's because I get some better CAS latency numbers. You can also change a few values in your BIOS to disable the power management of your processor, and that will actually increase the total performance in X-Plane 11. One of those is the CPU C states. Disable those and you will get some better performance. And another option in your BIOS is the Intel SpeedStep technology. That's an option to actually downclock your CPU when it's not fully used. I would recommend you to change that to disabled so the Intel SpeedStep technology is not used. And that could actually give you a little performance boost while playing X-Plane 11. For the GPU overclocking, I would highly recommend you to not use the MSI Afterburner overclocking software and instead download the Zotac Firestorm software. It's free as well and it has all the options you need, including changing the frequencies. You can monitor your GPU temperatures, you can change the fan speeds, you can change the memory clocks and much more. And this software is actually perfectly working in VR. As you see, my CPU is actually running at 1936 MHz right now while running the X-Plane 11, and I'm gonna higher up the settings just a little bit, around 80 MHz. Don't change it to 300 MHz or something like that, because that would actually probably crash your PC. So change it very slowly to maybe 80 or 85 MHz higher. Apply the settings and you'll see that your boost on your GPU will rise, like here, up to 2012 MHz. My GPU at GTX 1080 Ti can maximally do around 2000 MHz. I'm not gonna allow it to do and go any higher. As you can see, the GPU temperature may increase a lot, so I would actually recommend you to use manual fan speeds and change that to 60%, and you'll see that the GPU temperatures will actually decrease quite fast. You can even increase the fan speed to 80% or even 100%, and that will really cool down your GPU. And I would really recommend you to run X-Plane 11 with at least 60% of fan speed, just to have some better temperatures while having the GPU overclocked like this. You can also save this as a profile and load it up every time you start off X-Plane 11 to just make it easy, and you will have your higher clocked GPU right away. To make sure that your overclocked CPU and GPU can be stable while running X-Plane 11, I would recommend you to download some software that you can monitor the temperatures of your CPU and GPU and run some tests, run some benchmarks, and try out what's the maximum temperatures you can get, so you're sure that it's gonna work when you're playing with the X-Plane 11. So enough about the overclocking, let's jump in front of our PC. If you're using the Oculus Rift, you really need to download this free software called Oculus Trade Tool. This is a software that will allow you to change some of the crucial settings for your Oculus Rift, just like the power profile, the super sampling value, and also the ASW value, that reprojection value. As you can see, I'm using the maximum power plan, that's the maximum performance in the power plan option. I'm sorry it says hög prestanda in Swedish, but in English that's maximum performance. Furthermore, we are gonna suspend the USB selective suspend option, and the super sampling value, we're gonna leave that on 0 because we're gonna change the super sampling in Steam VR instead. The ASW mode is the asynchronous space warp option, that's the reprojection option, and for X-Plane 11 the best value is to use 45 frames per second. And you may wonder why I'm using locked 45 frames per second. Well, no PC so far can run X-Plane 11 in 90 frames per second stable. That's why with the Oculus Rift we're gonna run it on 45 frames per second, and the asynchronous space warp reprojection will reproject the 45 frames per second to 90 frames per second, and that will give us the most stable and butter smooth gameplay in X-Plane 11. As you may know, X-Plane 11 runs only through Steam VR, and that's why I highly recommend you to download a free plugin for the Steam VR called Advanced Open VR Settings. Download the software, install it, and you will have an extra tab in your Steam VR. The application super sampling is the most important value here, and that is the value that will give us more sharpness in X-Plane 11. I can run X-Plane 11 between 1.6 to 1.8 in super sampling or application super sampling, and it runs just fine. If you have a lower spec PC, I would recommend you to start off with 1.0. The compositor render target multiplayer, and that is a super sampling for the menus in SteamVR, so that does not affect the game itself. That only affects how the SteamVR menus are gonna look. So just put it on 1.0 and I think you're gonna be fine. The enable advanced super sample filtering is something that you should just have on. And down below we have the asynchronous reprojection options. There are 3 of them in SteamVR, but we are not gonna use any of them while running X-Plane 11 in virtual reality with the Oculus Rift. We're only gonna use the ASW reprojection that we switched on to 45 frames per second with the Oculus Tray tool. If you are using the HTC Vive playing X-Plane 11, I would highly recommend you to only use the asynchronous reprojection, but that is only if you are using the HTC Vive and not the Oculus Rift. Before we even install X-Plane 11 and start to tweak it, remember that the full installation of X-Plane 11 is above 90 gigabytes, and that's a lot of space. But you can actually prevent that by going to the properties of the game, pick the DLC tab and untick all the areas where you're not gonna fly in the X-Plane 11. In my case, I'm only flying in North America currently, so I only have this area installed on my computer. And the North America location is only around 13 gigabyte in space, and that's a big difference between 90 gigabyte and 13 gigabyte, of course. Another thing that we're gonna do before we start off the X-Plane 11 and try it is to download and install the application called Process Lasso. I have a pro license because I really think it's worth it. You can download it from the bitsum.com website. It is actually free. You get some more features when doing the full license, and make sure to use the 64-bit version. The Process Lasso tool allows us to change a lot of options, and there are so many things to change. First off, let's go into the active process and we're gonna see all the things running right now. As you can see, I have the X-Plane 11 running, including SteamVR, some OVR server that's for the Oculus Rift, and also the OBS. The OBS is only there because I'm recording this at the same time. First thing that you're gonna need to do in a Process Lasso Pro is to enable the performance mode enable. Next step is the most important one. We're gonna right click on the X-Plane 11 executable file and change some settings. The first one we're gonna change is the priority class to always high, so we get some better priority for the processor to work with X-Plane 11. You can probably put it on real time, but I'm not gonna do that now. Another thing is that we're gonna change the CPU affinity. Right now the game or the simulator is using all the cores and threads, but we're gonna change that, and we're gonna do that here. You can of course do it here as well manually, but it's actually faster to do it in here. And what we're doing now is that we are gonna exclude the first core and the first thread from this X-Plane 11 executable file. So the game is not using the first core and the first thread. And as you can see, in a moment, it takes a few seconds, but the core 1 and the thread 1 will be not used by the game anymore, just like now. There's a very good reason why we're doing that, and that is because if we are using all the cores and all the threads for X-Plane 11, we are at the same time also using the VR compositor and all the stuff in the background for the same cores, and that actually is one of the reasons we get some tracking loss with Oculus Rift. And if we change that, the X-Plane 11 is not using one of the cores and threads and allow the VR compositor to use just those 2 threads, they will not collide. So even though the X-Plane 11 process is fully maximized, it's not gonna affect the VR compositor, and that is actually the solution to get rid of the tracking issues, that flickering that happens sometimes while running the X-Plane 11 with the Oculus Rift. So what we're gonna do now is to go to all processes, we're gonna search for the VR compositor, and as you can see, it's running. So let's right click on it the same way as we did before and choose CP affinity, and go into select CP affinity and deselect all the cores and threads and accept the first 2 of these. So it's only using the first core and the first thread. This way they are not colliding with each other and they're not affecting each other in terms of performance. You can also do the same with the OVR server or the Oculus VR processes, maybe the Steam VR as well, or your caption software, but that's actually not needed. Another thing that's very important is to change the power options in Windows to highest performance. If you're using the process lasso tool, it's going to be called Bitsum, highest performance. Next thing we're going to do is to go into NVIDIA control panel, and that is the control panel for your graphic card, of course. Go into the 3D settings. I'm sorry, I have my control panel in Swedish, and change the energy saving mode to maximal performance. I think the default value is optimal performance, but changes to maximum performance. Don't change anything more here because we're gonna go into the second tab that is exclusively only for the X-Plane 11, and there we're gonna change one value that is very important for X-Plane 11 to run more stable. And that value is almost in the bottom of this list. Here we have the maximum performance that is already on, and almost at the bottom we find the threaded optimization. Turn that off because that will actually increase the performance drastically in X-Plane 11. So have it off, and that is called threaded optimizations. So let's begin with the fun part. Those tweaks that we are gonna do now are gonna change the frame rate drastically. This is a plugin called 3J FPS Wizard. It's a free plugin to download for the X-Plane 11, and this is a plugin that keeps the performance stable in X-Plane 11 by adapting the view distance and cloud quality. It's using a very smooth transition between visual quality and performance, so we can maintain a frame rate that we are choosing inside of this plugin, in this case 45 frames per second. I'm going to show you that in a moment. This plugin works perfectly in X-Plane 11 even though this guy doesn't say so. The installation of this 3G FPS plugin is very simple. You will need three things: the Fly with Lua, and you will need a library for that, and the 3G FPS Wizard profile file as well. While installing the Fly with Lua, I would recommend you to go with the complete edition of Fly with Lua, and I would explain that in a moment why. Because this guide says you should need the core version, but the complete edition is much better and it allows us to use some other cool tweaks that we are gonna use later on in this tutorial. So download the complete version and then keep on with downloading the library and then the 3G FPS Wizard. I'm not gonna go through the whole installation because I think it's quite simple to understand everything. You can just follow the instructions on those sites, and I will give you all the download links to those pages in the video description down here below under this video tutorial. So don't worry about that, the installation just takes a few seconds and those files are very small. Before we jump up into the air and try out the new plugin we just installed and configured, we're gonna install another plugin called Default Fog Control. It uses the same Fly with Lua library, and it's just one file that you download, and it's gonna give you much better visibility in X-Plane 11. You only download the file and put it in this directory. This is the X-Plane 11 resources, plugins, Fly with Lua and script directory. And if you open up the file, you're gonna have this little line only with the default value 1.0. We can of course change this value, and we are gonna do that, but we're gonna do that while flying, so you can see the difference in action while we're flying around in this simulator. So let's leave it on 1.0 for now and save the file. So don't forget to install this plugin because this is really gonna do the visibility much better. The strange thing about X-Plane 11 is that you actually need to start off the simulator without having Steam VR on. The game itself or the simulator itself will start off Steam VR automatically as long as you have chosen the VR option enabled in the options of the game. So before we start to tweak the game itself, let's jump into the settings inside of the game and we're gonna talk a little bit about it. This is the graphical settings and this is all we can change inside of the game. First off, we have visual effects, and this affects all the visual quality, the lighting, shadows, and the overall image quality in this simulator. I prefer to have it on the high with HDR setting on, but I would recommend you to start off with low settings and go from there. If you have good frame rate and not, you can higher it up to medium or high or even maximum with HDR and SSAO. Next one is the texture quality. If you have a GTX 1080 Ti just like I have, you can with no problems have it on maximum or even uncompressed level. If you have a GTX 1070 or even lower, I would recommend you to go lower on the texture quality settings because it's gonna use a lot of your graphical memory. If you have only 4 GB of VRAM or the graphical RAM, that will probably be not enough to have it on maximum. The anti-aliasing settings, there's a lot of different options like FXAA or the SSAA plus FXAA. And in this video, I'm going to be using this second level of anti-aliasing, that is 2 times SSAA including FXAA. That gives me the best performance. Also, if you change the visual effects to medium, you're gonna have only an anti-aliasing 2 times, 4 times, 8 times and 16 times, and there will be no SSAO or FXAA option available. I could probably go higher, but I'm not sure if that's actually necessary because we are actually using super sampling, and in this video I'm going to be using super sampling of 1.6 in SteamVR already. The draw shadows on scenery, well, I would not recommend you to use it because that would probably kill the performance. It even does so on my PC with a GTX 1080 Ti and the latest i7-8700K processor. Also, the monitor usage, I'm using windowed mode, and this option is actually not doing any difference. I don't know if it's even working in virtual reality. I'm not using any VSync, I'm not using the track IR, I'm not using the Matrox triple head to go, and of course I'm using the VR hardware enabled. The number of world objects is probably the most important value here. That value will change how much of buildings, trees and other things that you will see on the scenery. If you put it on high or on the maximum, you will get the maximum amount of auto-generated buildings and trees. I would probably recommend you to start off with low and go from there and see if your PC can handle more than that. With all those tweaks that we are gonna do in a moment, I can actually bump it up to maximum and still maintain a perfect frame rate of 45 frames per second and also reproject to 90 frames per second, of course. The reflection detail, let's just leave it off because the reflections are totally killing the frame rate in this simulator. It's really not usable for now in virtual reality. That is even more demanding than the anti-aliasing or the world object numbers. All the other settings are nothing you need to change. The field of view, there are some other stuff, but I would probably just leave them as they are because they're not affecting the performance. So those options here are all the options we can change for the graphic part, at least in Explain 11. But all the tweaks we are gonna do in a moment are gonna affect the performance a lot more than any of those settings actually. So keep on watching. So Explain 11 is now started. I have installed the Fly with Lua plugin, and I have also put some monitoring on the right side of this image so we can see the CPU temperatures and load, and also the GPU load and temperatures, just for fun, just so you can see how much the performance is drawn while using this simulator. As you can see, my frame rate right now is not good. It's only between 30 and maybe 35 frames per second maximum, and I have still not enabled the Fly with Lua plugin, and I'm gonna do that now, and then we're gonna see the huge difference in a second. Just as you see now, the frame rate jumps up to 45 frames per second stable. You can see 2 bars of that, but when we enable the plugin for the first time, we will not be able to go into the options of the plugin. So what we need to do actually is to close down the Explain 11 and restart it once again, and then we can go inside of the options of the plugin. So now I have restarted the Explain 11 and now we can see the plugin is running again. We are getting a stable 45 frames per second. As you can see, we see all the load of the GPU and CPU down here on the right side. So let's check into the options of this plugin, the Fly with Lua and the 3G FPS Wizard. I have already created a profile that is optimized for my system, and it's already running, as you can see, so we are getting the maximum 45 frames per second as we want. And it's plus minus a few frames, but it's mostly stable, and that's what we need. Let's turn it off for a second, and you instantly see that the frame rate is dropping to mid 30, maybe below 34 frames per second. We put it on auto and it's back to 45 frames per second. If we have it on 35 frames per second without this plugin, the game will not be playable in virtual reality. It's gonna be choppy, it's gonna be stuttery, it's gonna be a juddery mess. We have also some maximum FPS settings and maximum quality settings, but in this tutorial we're only gonna use the max FPS settings. So let's go into Advanced tab on this 3G FPS plugin, and as you can see we have a few pages on this plugin, so we can switch between, and the first page is FPS/quality. In this tab we're changing the minimum desired frames per second we want in this simulator, and I put it on 45. The maximum I put it just one frame above, so the PC does not need to render more than 46 frames per second because we are limited to 45 frames per second, and we're gonna double that with the ASW reprojection. So let's jump into the next page, and here we have the LOD options, the level of detail on far objects. If I turn it off, you're gonna see that's gonna be a drastic decrease in performance. That is one of the most important options here, and this is the level of detail, the minimum level of detail, and I set it even below that green little area, and also the LOD max is on 1.4. You can tweak it however you want, and it's gonna improve your performance so much depending on what CPU and GPU you have, of course. Next one is the visibility, and I put it on of course, and here we have the minimum visibility, and I'm gonna actually lower it a little bit to 15,000. That's even below the green marks, and the visibility on max is very low right now, it's 20,000. Let's just higher up a notch, and well, I'm not sure, it's gonna still try to maintain the 45 frames per second, so it doesn't matter how high you set it. And the other two options, I'm not changing them at all, they are just on default. So let's move on to the next one. There's a cloud density option, but we are not using any clouds, not for now in Explain 11, because the clouds are not working well. So I'm only flying with clear weather for now. The clouds look very strange in virtual reality so far, but this probably is going to be fixed later on. Same with the next page, is also for the clouds puff size, and as we're only doing clear weather, this is not needed right now. The last one is the FPS meter, and I have actually not changed anything here. We can probably change some settings and optimize this even further if you really miss those last frames per second that you really need, but I haven't done so. So there are no more pages, just save this profile and you are gonna have it there. Also, there is a wizard that you can go through if you want some more help setting all those values, but I just did it manually and I put it on max FPS, and as you can see, the performance is just so much better than on default. It's quite crazy that a plugin can make such a difference, and I will show you the difference in image quality and when we are up in the air flying around. It is a noticeable difference, but nothing that you will be bothered about. And finally, we are in Explain 11 and we're gonna take off in a second from the San Francisco International Airport. We have everything on here, the plugin is on. I'm just gonna change the layout so it's on the right side, so we can see this frames per second meter here and the default one on the left side. So let me just start off the airplane in a second here. I'm just gonna go full throttle and we're gonna release the parking brakes and take off, and I'm sure this is gonna be fun to see the difference in frame rate. Have your eyes on the frame rate counters all the time, because as long as it's on 45 frames per second, it's fully fluid in my VR headset. Remember that, guys. Even though the video may look stuttery a little bit, I can assure you that the frame rate inside of the headset is perfect, and it's fully fluid, not only my head movements, but also the scenery and everything else in the image, so that it's fully fluid and it really feels like 90 frames per second. So as you can see, there is no reprojection on the controllers, it's just fully fluid right now, and I can personally not see the frame rate counter right now because I'm inside of this simulator, of course, but you can see that, and I can assure you that I can feel that there is no frame loss whatsoever right now, thanks to this plugin and all settings and optimizations we have done. So guys, I'm just gonna change the view, the recording view, so you can see the full view that I am seeing instead of all the other things of my desktop, and you're gonna see how it looks inside of the headset. It may look like it's a little bit stuttery, that the frame rate is not enough, but I can assure you it is 100% butter smooth in my headset right now. And this is a problem actually while recording those videos with X-Plane 11. Look at the scenery there, it's fully fluid as I pass by, everything is fluid, my hand movements, my head movements, and the scenery as well. But the problem is here, when I'm recording it at the same time, it's not gonna look fluid, and that is an issue. And I don't know if that's an OBS Studio issue or something, but it should look fluid, but it's not. So let me just pause the game for a second, and I'm gonna show you something about the fog or the mist you see in the image right now on distance. Well, we are using the 3G FPS wizard, and of course it's gonna lower down the level of distance and everything, but it's actually fixable, and we can make it much more clear so you can see much more further, and that is thanks to that plugin we installed a moment ago, that fog control plugin. And here's the file again. We're gonna change the default value of 1.0 to 0.5, and the only thing we need to do is to go to plugins, fly with Lua, and reload the plugin, and look at the scenery now. I mean, it's much more clearer, the colors are clearer, the visibility is much further away, and it looks so much better. This little setting, let me just switch back to 1.0 again and reload the settings. Look at how much more fog. I know some of you may think that this looks much more realistic, but my preferable option here is to actually use 0.2 and check how this looks. There we go. It's so much more clear, the textures looks better at distance, everything looks so much more alive, especially the colors, and at distance we can really see those mountains and everything. Of course you can have somewhere in between, maybe on 0.3 or something, and it's still gonna be a little bit foggy, but it's not that foggy, there's not much of a haze anymore, and I think somewhere a level between 0.2 and 0.3 is the best one. And as you can see, we're still having the 45 frames per second. This does not affect the frame rate. If I turn off the frame rate now while in air, we're gonna do that in a second. We have it on max frames per second. Look at now. I mean, this is quite ridiculous. We are around 32 frames per second stable right now. So without this plugin, it's a huge difference. Let's turn it on. It takes maybe 1 second to adjust, and now we have fluid 45 frames per second. And yes, you can see a difference at distance how it looks, but I'm gonna show you more example on what this plugin really does and how much it decreases in quality. I don't think that's even much noticeable, and I don't think that's a problem because the scenery still looks great, and I'm still running with max object detail. All the maximum houses and trees and everything is on max, so it cannot look better than it does. And also, let's switch back into the options in the game, and I'm gonna show you my settings. If you don't believe me what settings I'm actually running, let me just pick off my headset and I'm gonna go into the options here. There we go. As you can see, visual quality on high, we have number of world objects on maximum, we have no reflections, we have maximum textures, and we have the anti-aliasing of 2x SSAA and plus FXAA. And also we're running in Steam VR, we are running the super sampling of 1.6. I can actually run it on 1.8 as well. But remember, all this would be never possible without this plugin, that 3G FPS plugin and that Fly with Lua library. It's so important, it does so much. So well, let's continue this little flight, and we're gonna fly a little bit more over San Francisco, and I'm gonna show you some more difference on how it looks on distance also between having this plugin on and off. If you see any stutter or anything in the image, I can assure you it's not visible in the headset. I think I got one stutter so far, that was actually a few minutes ago. And also, as you just saw, the colors just changed, and I'm not sure what that actually is all about, but that's something that happens sometimes in X-Plane 11. Well, everything is on. Let's turn off the FG FPS wizard, and as you can see, we are well around 30-40 frames per second. It's way below. If you turn it back to max FPS, it's gonna be stable 45 frames per second. It's so obvious, the difference is just so huge. And that is not only because of the FG FPS wizard, because if you're not overclocking your CPU, if you're not doing all the settings we have done, you will actually get some lower frame rates, and that's not, and I'm not sure if I would actually get 45 frames per second stable if I wouldn't use those all settings that I did, if I didn't do all those tweaks that I did before we even installed that plugin. And I'm gonna show you the visibility once again, the difference by having this FJFPS plugin on and off. So I'm gonna pause the game in a second, and I'm gonna just turn it off, and look now, we have 24 frames per second without all the tweaks on, or that FG FPS wizard on. It's really unplayable this way. Let's turn it on with max FPS, and we're back to fluid 45 frames per second, rep projected to 90. It's such a difference, it's just ridiculous. And it still looks great at distance. Look at that, look at the difference between the distance. I mean, of course, we're not gonna see the buildings at the distance. The textures may look a little bit different on distance, but it's still not a big difference in terms of video quality. I'm gonna go outside for a second and just show you, like that. And I'm gonna turn around a little bit so you can see all the buildings as well. You can see the San Francisco in the background. I'm gonna put on my headset again, and I'm gonna turn it off. Look at the frame rate. It's below 30 frames per second right now. And look at the city and the buildings. There we go. We turn it off. So we're not seeing a lot of buildings at distance, but we get instead a perfect frame rate. Here, down here, we still see the buildings, all of them. It's maximum world object detail, but at distance we are not gonna see everything. You can still see those big buildings at distance even though we turn it off. Well, I think this is like night and day, and if you haven't tried this 3G FPS wizard, you really should. So let's jump into the cockpit again, and we're gonna admire the view for a few seconds. I'm gonna show you some more here in a moment. As you can see at distance, there are a lot of buildings that are not shown just because the frame rate is, well, maximum, and the level of distance is lowered by the plugin. But I still think it works. It looks great, guys, I think. I mean, we still have all the buildings on maximum at, I mean, if you were a little bit closer, and take a look at the frame rate difference again. It's 30 frames, it's 15 frames lower, between 10 and 15 frames lower, and that is crucial in virtual reality. The max quality goes, well, somewhere in between, but the max FPS is gonna bring us a fully playable X-Plane 11 in virtual reality. And look at all the buildings. I mean, in my last gameplay video, I couldn't do maximum of world objects. It was just too stuttery, but then again, I was not using this plugin. I did not do all the hacks like I did before. So, and remember this default fog control, I'm gonna change it again just to show you how the default value looks if you don't install this fog control plugin. I'm just gonna reload the settings. There we go. Look how much more fog and haze it's on default in Explain 11. And yes, some of you may think this is actually looking more realistic, but if you're flying low just like I'm right now, I prefer to have it with much less of haze, maybe around a 0.5 or even 0.2. That is actually the default value I'm using when flying around. So guys, that was it. I really hope that you enjoyed watching this tutorial, and I really hope that this tutorial will help you getting some better performance or even double the performance in Explain 11. Well guys, if you would like to see more of Explain 11 here on SweViver, don't forget to subscribe and also hit the like on this video if you enjoyed it or if you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Also go back and check all the settings once again and really go through all the steps I'm talking about to improve the game, and I'm sure you will have a blast in Explain 11 because this is the best flight simulator out there, and in virtual reality it's just a wow. Anyway guys, thank you once again, have fun now and see you in the next video. Cheers!